Welcome to the next episode of Dr. Deborah's Q&A. Last week you had such a cute little show with my little son Lawrence on it, and thank you so much for all your feedback, and thank you so much for tuning into that. It's interesting because in our climate today we have so many different diverse topics, and I am enjoying bringing this to you, and I'm enjoying talking about these things that we never have really addressed before, at least not on this deep level. So this has been such an exciting time to begin this show and have such a diversity of questions and topics coming out. So keep them coming. Right now, one of the things that people are talking about is systemic racism. And to build on last week's show, Lawrence gave me a cute example, which I thought really hit home. He said, "Mama, imagine that you're Tom and you're going for a job. And well, you are just as qualified as the guy next to you. And in fact, you went to Ivy League schools and the other person didn't. And you have all of these connections in the industry. And you go in for the interview and they love you and they think you're a great fit, right? And there's another person in there that you're similar to, and then they don't give you the job. And they say, well, you're just not quite what our customers are looking for. Now, the only thing different between you and the other person is that you're a person of color and they're not, right? But the boss is afraid, well, if I hire that person, it doesn't quite go with the image we've had for years of what someone who works here looks like. So instead of saying, well, let's make a change, they hire the other person to keep their customer base. So therefore, Tom doesn't get the job. So you see, it's a systemic problem. It's not just the guy, he wasn't really being prejudiced, he was just trying to keep what he had, right? And so in doing that, he committed a racist act against this guy who just wanted a job, all because the fact that he did not look like their customer base, and he was afraid of losing the customers he had. Instead of thinking, oh, maybe this will bring in different customers, right? So with all of that said, if you have a question, drop it down here or send it to me on Instagram or Dr. Deborah, and we can definitely talk about it. So this week we have another question, which kind of piggybacks on that question. So the question is, so much focus has been given to Black and white issues. What about other people of color? Now, this is a huge question. Like, when I saw this question, I was like kind of taken back because there's so many different things coming on. You have all these people talking about, it's a Black and white issue and Black people dying, Black Lives Matter, which it does, and all lives matter. But I think people are focusing on that because there's a lot of things that haven't been addressed, like the pancake syrup or the Uncle Ben's rice. I mean, that's been there for years. And as a Black woman, for the first time, I could walk in a grocery store and the shelves were clean in that area. They weren't there. I didn't have to look at something that was from my past. And when people say, well, yeah, but that's not now. But I say to people, imagine that you're being traumatized and you're being hurt and somebody snuck in a window and took a picture of that. And for centuries, that pain has been used to make money off of. That's how that feels. So every time I see that, someone's making money off of pain, off of suffering. And so the fact that they pulled that off the shelves is, I can't put into words. I cannot put into words. So that means something. And that is part of the systemic racism problem. But what about other people of color? Because there's other things out there. I remember the Taco Bell dog. I mean, even down to the Quaker Oats person, there's other symbols out there. And are we forgetting other people of color in this? So to answer the question more fully, I have brought in an expert to talk to us. And, she's amazing. She's from the University of Redlands, and her name is Janee Both Gragg. And she has a very unique background. But you know what? I'm going to let her come in and introduce herself. So let me go and get her out of the waiting room. Hey, Janee.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I told the audience a little bit about you, but why don't you tell us about you too?
Sure. I'm a faculty member at the University of Redlands, and I've been there going on 12 or 13 years. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist here in California, as well as a professional clinical counselor and a certified drug and alcohol counselor. A lot of experience working with adolescents and families. And yeah, been at this work for a while. Known you a long time.
Long time, and we've known each other about that amount of time. We started
Yeah,
off
for
as
sure.
little babes together in the
Yeah.
field, right?
Yes.
So that's kind of awesome. And Janee is one of my very good friends and respected colleagues. So
Thanks for having me on, Deborah.
oh, absolutely.
Dr. Deborah.
So we had a question that came in to which frames why I'm talking to you. And I'm just going to scroll back up. And it was, so much focus is given to Black and white issues. What about other people of color? And I was like, wow, because we have spent a lot of time on that, right?
Yeah.
So are other people of color getting lost in what's going on today? What do you think?
I think that's a great question. I think it's an important question. You know, I think the environment might matter, and I can't speak to all environments, but I see it coming in different ways and in different spaces. Definitely in academia, it's a pretty inclusive conversation.
Mm-hmm.
In a lot of ways, I think the moment is about Black lives, and I think that that's okay. But I think that even within that movement, we're recognizing that it's bigger than Black lives, right? Like the moment calls for Black lives, but the people supporting Black lives are deeply engaged because they recognize the intersectionality of the moment, and that in some ways it involves so many other movements and issues, right?
I think it's more than just this movement and this issue. I think it's a lot of issues that are on there, you know.
Absolutely. And that people can relate from so many different areas and ways, who've experienced oppression and who still are experiencing that oppression. And
exactly. But are you surprised about how the world is reacting right now?
I mean, I think I can speak to both sides. On a personal level, sometimes it takes me back, right? Like maybe in my lifetime, I didn't anticipate it coming to a head in this way. I didn't live through the civil rights movement, and so I know people have talked about it feeling reminiscent of that. So in some ways, I'll reflect on feeling surprised. At the same time, it doesn't surprise me that it's coming to a head, right? When you're when we've lived in this way for so long in systems of oppression, and with people experiencing a lack of a way to have their voice heard for so long, it just makes sense that it comes to a head, right? And so for me, that merges in a way where I think the surprise or the shock of that also comes with like a real sense of awe and privilege to be in this moment and kind of recognizing the historical nature of it. And
I'm curious because you say that you use the word privilege or whatever, and some people may view you as someone with privilege, but I know you have so many backgrounds, right?
Yeah.
So what can you tell me, like, how does that feel like right now in the climate? Because people don't realize who you are, and I know how fabulous you are, and I know what's inside, but you know, how does that feel like walking around, you know, and knowing that there's this other part of you that's people don't know?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Deborah. I mean, that's part of the complexity, right, that we all have as individuals within culture and between culture, we're lucky if our closest people know us. And then we live with the assumptions that maybe people will put on us. And so I think as I navigate these spaces, part of the trauma that we all experience collectively, if we have any kind of collective consciousness about what's happening right now, is we have an opportunity to peel another layer of our onion, looking at ourselves and where we come from. And so even as a biracial or a multiracial person, white passing, I recognize that on one side of my family, there was some deep racism, and on the other side of my family, we were quite brown and a little too brown for the racist side, right? Yeah. So, and so as I'm peeling my own, next layer and looking at that in the context of what's happening right now, like, that's a layer of complexity that, the average person, the average colleague that I work with may have no idea that on one hand, I have a deep understanding of the complexities that are playing out, and I've lived that in my own life. But also, like, I have to challenge my own thinking on a regular basis because I grew up with subtleties and biases that influence my own thinking on a regular basis, right? And that I need to be challenging myself on a regular basis and making sure that I'm looking deeply at the systems within which I have privilege because I'm white passing, and making sure that I'm challenging within those systems the status quo. It's complicated.
It's complicated. And I'm wondering, because you have, that privilege, like, what can you do from within? Like, when you see these things happen, Yeah. Because you're in a unique position to feel it, but also be able to recognize it, and it could be just something very simple,
I think it's complicated. It's all, I think there's different levels. So I think there's an internal level that's more individual, where, you have to ask yourself, are you willing to peel the layer of the onion, right? Like, we can be complacent. We can say, too many of us say, well, I'm not racist, and that shuts off the conversation. It shuts off the opportunity to engage in personal growth. And so on an individual level, we can challenge ourselves to say, what's happening here that allows me to move to a deeper level of consciousness, collective consciousness, to what's happening right now. And then also the larger systems levels, like, how do I engage every day and navigate different systems every day where I see injustices and inequities that I may gain from or benefit from, where others are oppressed or have less voice, right? Where I can speak, where I can acknowledge that and see that, and I can speak on their behalf.
So what do you mean by collective consciousness? Like, define that.
Sure. I think that collective consciousness is well, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is part of that, right? Like, some people, when that movement first started, not everybody was ready to embrace what that message was about, or, like, that's hard work to really take in what was happening, what that meant, that Black people were dying at the hands of a system that wasn't ready to acknowledge the implicit bias that allowed for a trigger to be pulled too soon, right? And justified it because in a moment of fear, they felt that they could justify that that another individual, a Black individual, may or may not have a gun.
Exactly.
I mean, that's what it came down to, right?
Yeah.
And we had to pick that apart and say, that doesn't justify a life. And there were complexities around that, and people weren't ready at a collective societal level to embrace that. And what we see now is that after these repeated, after these repeated incidents that are visually represented in the mass media, right, that our knowledge and our understanding is heightening. Yeah. And people who maybe were grappling with it, or it was flying under the radar, are becoming more aware. It's in our consciousness a little more, right? Yeah. It's not as easily ignored, and so it's I think it's challenging people to peel that layer, that onion layer, right? So I go to that analogy because in counseling, we talk about when we do our own work, right? Maybe that first layer is kind of crispy and cruddy and you're peeling that layer. But that's our work in life, right? And so as we come to know ourselves better and we come to know the issues that our onion is kind of contextualized in with our family and our neighborhoods and our work lives, right? That we have work to do and we have some layers of that onion to peel. And so I think individually that's happening for people. And as it happens for multiple individuals together in communities and nationally, and now we see it across the world, right? That together our levels of understanding and knowledge about these issues is rising.
Yeah.
And there's power in that.
There definitely is.
Yeah.
There's definitely power in that. And, you know, you've done a lot of work with Latina youth and things like that. And I think that is somewhere to start too. You know, I remember we did this whole study on it in education and making a change and meeting the client where they're at, right? And bringing that in, because that when you talk about the systems, there's a system, right? And there's you and I interacting together, trying to change that system, you know, just by showing people that there could be a difference, right?
Yeah. I definitely think the absolute most empowering thing about, and the most influential thing about how I'm doing or how things are playing out right now in this climate is the privilege that I have to be in the classroom right now, like to work with students who are training to eventually be on the front lines to do this work, grappling with their own family, social, neighborhood context, you know, cultural contexts, exploring their own implicit biases, embracing that fully, going, my ethical responsibility is to peel layers of my onion so I can go help others without bias, right?
Yeah.
And doing it at a time where there's a pandemic and their learning has had to go online and they're asking, like, am I getting my money's worth? And I did a group counseling. I was training group counseling this last semester. And so not only were they learning textbook knowledge, they were in real time saying, okay, we're gonna address the issues that are playing out and affecting us. So they're like, this is what we're seeing in the media and this is what's challenging us. Like just kind of like what we're talking about now. We're talking about this because this is a current issue. This is what we're thinking about. Our families are thinking about, our friends are thinking about. This is what's current and relevant and society is dealing with, and they were wrestling with this, and it was inspiring. It's an act, I consider it a privilege and an act of social justice and advocacy in itself, in support of these issues, to be training students at this time. Like to be in the academy addressing these issues seems as powerful as being on the streets, right? And so I've been really reflective about that right now as well.
Yeah, and that's like awesome, because you know there's a lot of literature that talks about how us as educators can change things, but sometimes we may be the first contact for someone to start looking at their biases and their prejudices, right?
Exposure.
I mean, there's a couple of theories, one by Helms, one by Cross, and it talks about racial identity from a Black perspective and a white perspective, and the first one is contact, right?
Exposure.
And having contact, we might be contact for somebody right now, right? To begin to look different, because we're having this conversation. We're able to sit down and have this conversation. And even though we are lots of things, people are going to see it and go and look at exactly what our outsides are and not realize all that other stuff. But that's okay, because we can bring in our worldview, right?
Yeah. A lot of my students are shocked when I tell them, like, I was a first generation student, or that I struggled in school and my family didn't think I'd graduate high school. They're like, you know, they're inspired by that. They're like, how did you get here? You know, oh, if she can do that, I can do that, right? And they start to hear a different story, you know, and they can see themselves in different roles. And absolutely. Yeah. And they maybe didn't even hear about racial identity development.
No,
That's a thing.
None of that. And are you reading, like, to bring this home with you about who you are you reading a book that's helping you right now in your own home? What is it?
I have it sitting here on my desk. So, and I have a little, it's an interesting story. So it's Raising White Kids. And yeah, so my 13-year-old probably won't be thrilled that I'll share this story with you, Deborah, real quick, but so an unfortunate situation in middle school. Middle school's tough, man, and there was an altercation on the basketball court, and he got hit by a black kid, and he didn't hit back. And I'm very anti-violence, and he kind of knew that. And it was interesting, the response that he got. Initially, we got a call from the public safety or security, whatever they're called, the people on the playground.
School police.
Yes, yeah. And the immediate message to us was, your kid didn't do anything wrong, right? But just so you know, this happened. And then some of the messaging as we shared the story was like, he didn't defend himself, right? So there was these underlying messages about maybe masculinity and the expectation that he would have defended himself. His thing was, I didn't want to lose basketball, right? Because he plays for a travel team. And I think he, and then we were really impressed. Our 13-year-old thought in those milliseconds about his behavior and what the consequences might be. So as parents, we really wanted to praise that. But in the end, we understood that the conversation would have been very different if he had hit back, not just because he acted in a violent way and there was consequences for that behavior, but because it was a racial issue potentially, right? And when I asked my son what happened and how things played out, he explained to me that the kid was a football player and he shouldn't have been on the basketball court. He didn't know what he was doing. And he comes out there every day trying to play basketball, but the kid's a football player.
Oh, wow.
And somebody had to tell him. And I said, so it wasn't enough that you get some private coaching and that you're on the travel team and that you have nice, I think they call them kicks.
Mm-hmm.
You have nice tennis shoes. Like, you had to be the kid. You had to be the one. You had to be the one to tell him. I kind of sound calm now, but I wasn't calm. I was pretty upset. And I said, so essentially what you're telling me is you threw the first punch, right? He threw the first punch, and I'm not okay with that. And there were consequences for that. And so to me, it was still an issue of class and privilege and him not understanding his position and throwing a first punch. And so we had a lot of long talks about that. And I understood that his white privilege or appearance of white privilege, right, was part of the calls that I was getting about, your son didn't do anything wrong. And I resented that too, because my son did everything wrong in that situation. I mean, except that he didn't hit back, and I appreciated that. So on consultation, the book was recommended to me, and I ordered it on Amazon, and my son opened the Amazon package. I told my partner, I was like, oh yeah, that's my book. He can, open it up, whatever. And my son brought it to me and he said, Mom, is this yours? And he kind of tossed it at me. And I said, yeah, that's my book. And he's like, what is that? And I said, oh yeah, it was recommended to me, because of everything happening in school. I just thought I would do some reading up. And I could see this like really confused, hurt look on his face. I'll never forget it. And he kind of tossed it at me. And I said, I mean, I know you're not white, right? But like, you look white. Other people think you're white. And he threw his hands up in the air and he said, Mom, you're the only person that says that to me. Like, he had this huge sense of relief that I could acknowledge that for him. And I had such a mix of emotions, because on one hand, I understood I had done a good job making sure that he understood his background, South American, Venezuelan, and he saw himself as brown, right? But he's also learning that he has a lot of privilege because of how other people perceive him, and that in middle school and for most of the rest of his life, he's just a white kid, right? And that means something, and it means something really different in middle school than it means for me in the academy, and he's trying to figure out, how privilege in middle school looks really different than it does for me. And so he's trying to navigate through some of that stuff.
That's amazing. Every time I talk to you, I get blown away by something. Yeah, we've known each other a long time. So how do people, I think it's amazing that you can understand that and teach that to your kids. Because I've met your kids, they're amazing, right? And the fact that they're like, but I'm brown, but why are you reading that? Like, you know, they got it, you know, and that's where it starts, right? In those one-on-one systemic interactions, right?
I was shocked that he got it too, and I had to cover for myself real quick, right? No, I know. But other people think, you know, I'm learning too, Deborah. I'm learning with it. It's so humbling.
But that's the amazing thing, is that you're learning and you're not thinking you got it all. And that's where people have to start. So how do people get a hold of you?
Wow, that's a good question. So probably Dr. Janee BG at Gmail would be the best way. Dr. Janee BG.
All right, and they can contact me and I will have them reach out to you. So I'm gonna put you back in the waiting room, close out the show, and then we'll talk.
Great, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you. Okay, wow, that was a powerful conversation. And looking at that, you know, it's very interesting, different takes on that. I mean, here's Janee, who interacts as a white person, but inside, I mean, she is definitely Latin and she has a Latin background. So she gets to get the other side of the coin, but look at how she's raising her kids. Inclusive and knowing who they are, but knowing the privilege that they have just by walking around in the world. How amazing is that? And so how relevant is this today? Very relevant. Very, very relevant, because, you know, people can have perceptions and teach their kids to interact anyway, and it all starts in the home. And it is not just a black and white system, as you can see. And all the things that she said, like everybody's affected. Her kids, you know, all of her different identities of who she is brings all of that to the forefront. And she has to figure out how she's going to be inclusive, having all those perspectives and the privilege that she has. So how would I talk to my BFF? You just heard me talking to her. I mean, you heard it right here. But one of the things that I will say is, you've heard me say this before, how are we showing up? How did she show up at that school? She could have said, oh, you know, you did this to my son or whatever, but she listened to the entire situation and told his son, just by his words, he threw the first punch, because what he took it upon himself to say that. And how is that perceived? That's perceived as privilege, right? So it's a bigger issue. And so we have to look at how we're showing up. And he got a big lesson in that today. And you know, thank you, Janee, for parenting in that way. This is a bigger issue than we all know about, but it is an amazing thing to keep talking about. So to wrap us all up, we discussed some heavy issues. We discussed systemic racism. Lawrence gave us a great example of that. We talked about how you're perceived in society and how you can help other people. We talked about different racial identities. So if you want any of this information, remember, you just drop me a line. You can find me at drdeborahwarner.net. You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Deborah Warner, and same on Facebook, or you can drop something here and we will get back to you. And because your comments and your feedback is very important to me. And just to give you an update, Lawrence's book, the cover has been done. That book is going to drop soon, Beavers, Foxes, and Grizzly Bears. And oh, don't forget the cheetahs, the fishes, and the sloths too, about organizational leadership. And that will be coming out. And he will be doing a book signing at our script conference, which is July 3rd and 4th. And it will be on Zoom. So go to thescriptconference.com and register. And I really hope to see you all there. It's going to be an amazing time. We have Sheriff McDonald opening it up. We have Anne-Marie Johnson as our keynote speaker. We have community interventionists. We have people coming from France, different places, to just speak at the script conference and provide information, but also work as a community to solve some heavy issues. So please go to thescriptconference.com and register. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I can't wait to do the next video.